In the early 1960s, when Dorothea Lange's doctors said she had only months to live, there were still projects she was planning. She wanted to document the unionization of migrant workers in California. She dreamed of creating a massive FSA-style photo documentary of people in America's largest cities. But her secret passion would be a gift to her family. She wanted to take pictures of all her children and grandchildren. She felt she had neglected them while she traveled for the government and magazine assignments, and while writing books with her husband Paul Taylor. But none of those projects would be completed. Instead, she seized the opportunity to work with a major museum to mount a retrospective of her life's work.
In 1964, John Sarkowski, director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, told Lange he wanted to do a retrospective of her work. Over the next 2 years, she devoted herself to assisting Mr. Sarkowski, even though going through her photo file and agonizing over selections meant exhausting her limited energy.
As she perused the hundreds of Depression-era photos she hadn't seen in decades, her memories must have been overwhelming. All the miles in the car across the West, the South, and America's drought and wind-wasted heartland, the hundreds of stops at migrant camps, country stores, and sharecropper shacks, the barefoot mothers and their children. She recalled the painfully brief visits with those dignified middle-class families walking the roads in search of work, carrying suitcases or pushing carts filled with their belongings. All the images of needy people and their children must have evoked intense feelings. How had she coped with those feelings every time she pressed the shutter and smiled in gratitude at those penniless families? It must have helped her to think of herself as a social scientist, an observer of people. With Paul Taylor, she had written a book about the migrants from the Dust Bowl. It was called An American Exodus. Taylor, a University of California economist, taught her to make objective and accurate captions of her photographs, sometimes using her subject's own words. Lange and Taylor were dedicated to documenting the great erosion of people from America's heartland. Even though academic objectivity might have helped them cope with human suffering, anyone looking at Dorothea Lange's photographs today can see her feelings written all through them.
Two events shaped Dorothea's life as a young woman. The first was childhood polio that left her with a partially paralyzed leg and a slight limp, something that disturbed her for the rest of her life. Later on, Dorothea admitted her limp affected everything she did.
Polio was perhaps the most important thing that happened to me. It formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. All those things at once. I've never gotten over it.
The second event was her father's desertion. A successful attorney, Henry Nutzhorn, abandoned the family without explanation when Dorothea was 12. Determined to put her husband's betrayal behind her, Dorothea's mother changed the family name to her maiden name of Lange. She found work as a librarian in Manhattan's Lower East Side, easily supporting Dorothea and her brother from the library's generous salary. Dorothea went to PS 62 on Manhattan's Lower East Side. The school was filled with ambitious, immigrant, predominantly Jewish children of hard-working families who desperately wanted to move uptown away from the squalid polyglot culture of the Lower East Side. In 1895, the year of Dorothea's birth, Jacob Riis had produced stunning images of the desperate poverty of the Lower East Side slums of New York. At PS 62, and later at high school at Manhattan's elite Wadley Girls' School, Dorothea found the rich diversity of New York's slums a magnet. Sometimes she and her friend Florence Ahlstrom would cut classes to walk the streets of the Lower East Side. The bustling crowds and immigrant life fascinated her. She later recalled in an interview how she managed to get through the tough neighborhoods by putting on a face, a kind of expressionless mask that would draw no looks from the people she passed. Dorothea said using that same face made it easier for her to photograph in the migrant camps without appearing too eager or aggressive. She said it made people less defensive and more accepting of her.
After graduating from high school, she got work in several New York photo studios, learning the techniques of negative developing, printing, and retouching. From a string of what she called lovable hacks, she absorbed the lessons of portrait photography, including posing, set design, and lighting. Eventually, she took basic photography classes with Clarence White at Columbia University, but never completed any of his assignments. She thought them too dull. White, an introspective man, never chided her for failing to turn in assignments, but taught her through what she explained later was his quiet charisma. At the end of White's class, Dorothea purchased a large camera with 2 lenses and began taking portraits of her family. With the help of an itinerant photographer, she converted a chicken coop into a darkroom behind the family house. Sadly, years later, Dorothea's mother threw out all those early portraits.
In January 1918, at age 23, Dorothea and her school friend Florence Ahlstrom boarded a steamship in Hoboken and set off for a trip around the world. Their initial stop was New Orleans, where they boarded a train for San Francisco. When their initial money ran out, the plan was for Dorothea to work in a photo lab. Florence, a Western Union telegrapher, was promised work in any Western Union office in the world. With their funds restored, the friends would continue on their trip. In San Francisco, a pickpocket robbed them of all their money, forcing the 2 women to find work. Thanks to her prior training and experience, Dorothea easily found a job retouching portrait photos in a local lab. She was so good, she was encouraged to start her own business. In 1919, with the help of a sponsor, she opened her own studio on Sutter Street, next to a fashionable art gallery, and almost immediately became successful making portraits of wealthy Jewish families. These families were the major patrons of the San Francisco art community. Dorothea was soon a financial success and well known among the photographic elites of San Francisco, including Ansel Adams and Imogene Cunningham. All that would change after Wall Street crashed in 1929.
By 1933, the Depression had begun to diminish her business and the quality of her portraits. She was distressed that she had to lower her standards by mounting her portraits on plain white boards instead of handmade Japanese paper with decal edges. She was now also 38 years old and restless. Less business gave her more time to think about her career. Was portrait photography really what she wanted? Or had it simply been the expedient thing to do when she married and had children? Maynard Dixon, a well-known painter, and her husband of 13 years, had begun to spend more time away from her with his bohemian art friends. He was free, but she was strapped in a conventional role of wife and mother. Always independent as a child and young adult, she wanted more. Her good fortune making portraits of the city's elites had all happened so fast. That kind of immediate success with her photography had confirmed her as a businesswoman. Yet success within the wealthy classes had led to an isolation from the middle-class values she had known in New York. She remembered her invigorating walks in New York's Lower East Side. One day after school, she had actually walked from 100th Street to the Battery. So many different kinds of people, the matrons with their furs, the dirty men sleeping in doorways, and ragged children running loose in the noisy streets. It was all there, life in all its diversity. As a teenager, she had been thrilled to take it all in, and to think someday she might take photographs of it. During those walks in New York, Dorothea Lange had decided to become a photographer.
From her San Francisco studio window, she could gaze at the scene of unemployed men smoking and loitering in small groups on the street. She knew she was unaware of many of California's social problems and must have felt it was time to get back on the street and learn more. She needed to see with her own eyes how the Great Depression had changed her city. Following her insatiable curiosity, aroused on those walks in New York's Lower East Side, Dorothea entered the rough world of the city streets once again. This time, though, she had her camera. In an area not far from her studio, she made her first photographs of people impoverished by the Depression. She said until then she had not been on the street with a camera. In an interview in 1964 with the Smithsonian for the Archives of American Art, Lange recalls that day and says it changed her career.
People warned me. They said, "Oh, don't go there." I ignored them. A rich woman they call the White Angel ran a bread line. One morning as the men were queued up for a handout, I took one of my most famous photographs, an old man with his tin cup. I just saw something and I shot it. Back home, I put the old man's picture on my studio wall along with several others. I struggled for months and months with those photographs. My portrait customers would come in and just glance at my little gallery of street photos. The only comment I ever got was, "What are you going to do with this kind of thing? What do you want to do this for?" That was a question I couldn't answer. I didn't know. I knew I wanted to earn my living, put it that way. I was married, I had 2 children, and I could have stayed home. But I felt differently. I wanted to earn money. I was independent. I wanted to help. So that was the question. How was I going to do it? What was I going to do?
During the height of the Great Depression, the American public became deaf to the promises of politicians in Washington. Much of what the politicians said rang as empty promises. The public craved immediate action to relieve the spreading economic collapse. Stalinist Russia showed outward signs of progress with its massive industrial building programs and seemed to be an alternative to America's failed capitalism. Communist political cells proliferated in the United States and elsewhere around the globe. Social and union agitation was in the air. Politicians were fearful communism would take hold of America.
Well, there were communists and mass meetings and demonstrations going on. There was a good deal of social ferment. May Day came along, and I heard there was going to be a big demonstration. I thought I'd better go there and see why people were demonstrating. I had more confidence now because I'd photographed people in the bread lines. This was a labor demonstration, so I set a goal. I will go there, I will photograph this thing, I will come back and develop it, I will print it, and I will mount it, and I will put it on the wall all within 24 hours.
Lange was excited about this new direction in her photography, but was worried. Could she keep going with it and still be a wife, mother, and contributor to the family income? Answers to these questions were clear once her photographs of the labor demonstration appeared in major publications and in Washington, D.C.
A friend saw some of my labor demonstration photographs and told me, "They're valuable, they're useful," and contacted someone at a magazine called Survey Graphic. It was more of a social welfare magazine, more connected with settlement houses and social welfare problems, not political commentary so much. And the magazine bought one of my labor demonstration photographs and printed it full page. The photo showed a street speaker talking into an old-fashioned microphone. It's still printed occasionally. Underneath the photo, they printed the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." That caption was no favor to me, but that's what they did. Made me a communist right away. It accompanied an article written by a professor at the University of California. He telephoned me about this picture. He suggested that if there was any possibility I could do field work, he had a grant from the state of California to investigate agricultural labor. And he wanted photographs as a visual support for his report. He asked whether I could do this. He knew they couldn't get me hired as a photographer, so I was offered a job on the state payroll as a stenographer. I went on several field trips to take notes and photograph what this social scientist and his crew were investigating, and that was the first time I saw how trained people in a field like this operated. The leader of the California team was Paul Taylor, who would become my second husband. Once Taylor's report was filed in Washington, the connection was made with Rexford Tugwell and the Resettlement Administration, and with Roy Stryker, head of its historical division.
In 1935, Stryker asked Lange to join his photography section. Once on the team, Lange lobbied Stryker hard for an assignment in Southern California's Imperial Valley. She knew the valley was a flashpoint for labor violence. The daily surge of Dust Bowl families into this region had created a labor crisis. Harvesting peas and lettuce did not provide enough work to sustain these families. Wages were so low they could not meet the families' needs. But migrants continued to pour into the valley. On arrival, they sought immediate shelter in temporary government camps constructed near the harvest. But these camps filled quickly, forcing many families to live in their cars. Local officials were hostile to the camps, fearing such a concentration of workers would lead to violence, unionization, demands for higher wages, and even communism. Local sheriffs looked the other way as thugs, organized by the growers, attacked the camps and beat up and killed suspected agitators. In these brutal assaults, women and children also died. Stryker sent the Lange and Taylor team into the Imperial Valley. Lange as photographer, and Taylor as note-taker and bodyguard. But there really was no danger to them. Dorothea had a way of putting people at ease almost immediately.
You know, so often it's just sticking around and being there, remaining there, not just swooping in and swooping out in a cloud of dust. Sitting down on the ground with people. Letting the children look at your camera with their dirty, grimy little hands and putting their little fingers on the lens. And you let them, because you know that if you behave in a generous manner, you're apt to receive it. Lange arrived in a temporary camp for migratory workers set up near Brawley in California's Imperial Valley. Each family unit had a wooden platform covered by a canvas with no windows, no light or air except for the front and back flaps. You can imagine the following events as Lange approached one of those tents. As she gets closer, she sees a flap pull back. She starts talking, asking them about the harvest, where they came from. What happens to the children during the day? Do they go to school? As she's talking, the mother appears in the opening, with a large family now visible inside. There's more conversation, and the father emerges for a photo with his youngest. Soon the entire family is out. The mother and the father have their picture taken, and from the photo you can tell all is not right between them. After photographing, Lange would sit in her car and write down everything, including quotes. Writing a caption for each photograph was what her husband, Paul Taylor, taught her to do, and what so pleased her boss, Roy Stryker, back in Washington. They all agreed that the caption and the photo were a unit. One was meaningless without the other. Here's her caption from this visit. Brawley, California, Imperial Valley, 1939. In a Farm Security Administration migratory labor camp. Family of mother, father, and 11 children. Originally from Oklahoma, where he had been a tenant farmer. Came to California in 1936 after the drought. Since then, they have been traveling from crop to crop in California, following the harvest. 6 of the 11 children attend school, wherever the family stops long enough. 5 older children work along with father and mother. February 23rd. 2 of the family have been lucky. Got a day's work in the peas on the Sinclair Ranch. Father had earned about $1.73 for a 10-hour day. Oldest daughter had earned $1.25. From these earnings, they had to provide their transportation to the fields 20 miles away. Mother wants to return to Oklahoma, father unwilling. She says, I want to go back where we can live happily and live decent and grow what we eat. He says, we can't go back the way I am now. We've got nothing in the world to farm with. I made my mistake when I came out here.
Dorothea and her driver, Mr. Partridge, logged thousands of miles over roads that headed west from the Dust Bowl and north and south across the Imperial Valley. Every day they saw walking families pushing carts filled with clothing and young children. Mothers carried infants on their hips. As the sun set, these families would move off the road to camp. Before sunrise, they assembled their belongings to begin another day, often with aching, empty stomachs. It was a dangerous life. The rural highways exposed these families to attack from other vagrants looking for food or cash. Women walked the roads, but almost always in the company of a man who could offer protection in return for favors. Families camped along the roadside unless run off in the middle of the night by landowners. Local growers thought these vagrants were the scum of society, but the growers could not harvest without them. Many of the drifters were penniless, yet did not wear rags. Some of Lange's photos clearly show mothers well turned out in simple dresses. There were men in 3-piece suits and a fedora. Their clothing and suitcases made them appear middle class. Lange may have wondered if middle-class vagrants would arouse more sympathy in congressmen who might see these images. Dorothea made a decision to photograph the families so as to preserve their dignity. She shot them from a low angle so they looked down on her. Men in small groups, or as singles, also walked. They were called hobos or bindle stiffs. They carried everything they owned in small sacks over their shoulders. Social outcasts, they were absolutely critical to the harvest in California. Depending on the crops ready for harvest, they walked from farm to farm. The growers physically abused them and called them communist agitators. Bindle stiffs knew not to camp together because the growers' men would bloody them and drive them off. Hobos generally walked alone or in pairs so as to attract minimal attention. Dorothea reports Mr. Partridge often got impatient, stopping so often to talk to the families and to the single men. But her conversations on the side of the road added to the photographs and their captions. What those captions fail to reveal is how Lange coped with her feelings of first learning so much about those families, then simply driving off. She may have wondered what these photographs could possibly mean to someone who wasn't there. Years from now, would anyone care? The most famous photograph of the Great Depression was almost never taken. At the end of a long day photographing California migrant workers, Dorothea Lange was ready to go home. She had spent a month by herself photographing migrants and had plenty of negatives. The sun was low, it was cold, and rain fell. Facing several more hours of driving before she made it home, Lange was completely exhausted. Driving along US 101 in February of 1936, she spotted a migrant camp near Nipomo, about 2 hours north of Santa Barbara. A small hand-lettered sign said Pea Pickers Camp. She drove on beyond it for about 20 miles until she started to have an argument with herself.
Dorothea, what's going on in that camp back there? What is the situation? Nobody could ask this of you now, could they? Haven't you plenty of negatives already on this subject? Isn't this one more of the same? Besides, if you take a camera out in this rain, you'll just be asking for trouble. She turned around. After arriving back in the camp, Dorothea learned that a freeze had killed the peas. There was no work. She spotted a woman and her children in a lean-to. The woman was Florence Thompson, whose image would be immortalized in Lange's photo, Migrant Mother. Thompson's grandson recalled the day Lange pulled up in her car.
The look of hunger was already in the camp. Within a week, death would be there too. First the very young and the very old. Soon the locals would descend on the camp, arresting some, beating others, but scattering all to the four winds.
Decades later, details would emerge about Thompson and her family. They had subsisted on birds the children killed and frozen vegetables stolen from the fields. Thompson, 32 at the time Lange arrived, was like most women on the road during the Great Depression. With no contraceptives and needing to attach to a man for protection and sustenance, women had many children, sometimes with several husbands. Thompson had married 3 times and had 11 children. Some of these children, weakened by malnutrition, had died. When Lange arrived in the camp, Thompson's husband was off trying to get the car repaired. In her caption, Lange mistakenly says the family had sold the tires for money to buy food. Tired and cold, Lange cut short her usual warm-up banter. She quickly identified herself as from the government and began to pose mother and children. The shot sequence is typical of Lange. There were 4 photos before she finally positioned mother and 2 children the way she wanted. She moved dirty laundry out of the way and eliminated the oldest daughter from the final photograph. Dorothea knew from experience small children would make the image more poignant. The final photo showed 2 daughters turned away from the camera but leaning on their mother. A swaddled baby lay in Thompson's lap. When Lange returned home to Berkeley and developed the negatives, she knew she had some special photos. She sent the Thompson prints to the San Francisco News. They published 2 of them, $200,000 in contributions to help Nipomo's destitute migrants quickly flowed into the newspaper. Florence Thompson became the icon of the Great Depression.
2 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order requiring the military to send anyone perceived as a potential threat to internment camps. Although the order does not name Japanese Americans, any person with at least 1/64th Japanese ancestry was sent to the camps. Roosevelt's order also became an open invitation to loot and sell the homes and businesses of Japanese Americans. The U.S. government required no such relocation for Italian Americans and German Americans, even though Nazi saboteurs were active on American soil. Roosevelt's executive order fostered a flood of local regulations that bore striking similarities to the racial Nuremberg laws used to oppress Germany's Jews. In 1942, the War Relocation Authority assigned Dorothea Lange to photograph the relocation of several families to the Manzanar camp in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. The camps, hastily built tar paper shacks, were freezing in winter and stifling in summer. The evacuees received minimal rations and protective clothing. 2 fences of barbed wire surrounded the camp. People trying to escape received 2 orders to halt before guards shot them. Army escorts limited where Lange went and the photographs she took. Before her photos were published, the Army impounded them for 30 years. In 1972, many of Lange's Japanese-American relocation images appeared in a traveling photography show. This was the first time Americans became aware of this egregious injustice to its own citizens.
At war's end, Dorothea's health further declined. She spent much of her time at home, with many visits to the hospital to deal with abdominal pain. Her doctors told her she had terminal cancer of the esophagus. Determined to live as normally as possible, she willed herself to have the energy to make trips to Asia, Egypt, and South America with Paul, and to Ireland with her son and assistant, Daniel Dixon. She managed to collaborate on several magazine articles, confer with Edward Steichen on the Family of Man photo exhibit, film an interview with San Francisco Educational Television, and teach photography classes at the University of California. But before long, even the simplest tasks exhausted her. When John Sarkowski, curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, in 1964, asked to do a retrospective of her work, Dorothea put all her remaining energy into helping him select and organize her photographs. The Museum of Modern Art had honored only 4 photographers with individual shows: Walker Evans, Paul Strand, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and Edward Weston. The Lange retrospective opened January 26, 1966. Dorothea did not see it. She died October 11, 1965.